Thank you, thank you, thank you. You bless us. Oh, good morning. So you ready to go for a little wander in the wilderness? That doesn't sound very inviting to me. The desert, the dirt, the scorpions, all those things. We are exploring in these past few weeks and in the coming weeks how to deal with those times in our life of change. Now, some changes are good. We embrace them, we welcome them, they're great fun. Some changes we are not so excited about. But change is change, and there are steps we can take in each scenario that can help us move through the change with confidence. And even more than that, we can actually move through times of change and grow as spiritual beings. See, it's not just about change, it's about transformation at depth. When you jump in your car to go wherever it is you need to go, what are you most focused on? I know when I get behind the wheel, I'm focused on where I'm going. And I don't pay a whole lot of attention to what happens along the way, as long as I get where I'm going. Well, part of our lesson this morning is to pay attention to what happens along the way, because it is through the journey that we grow spiritually. Just getting to where we're going as spiritual beings isn't necessarily the goal. The journey is where deep and profound transformation takes place. It's as important as the arrival, perhaps even more important than the arrival. And if we pay attention to the journey, if we're in that process, in the moment, we are actually changed by the journey. And when we arrive at the next phase of our life, our next step, we arrive as a different person. What we're going to do today is delve into the story from the Old Testament, the story of the Exodus. It has some wonderful metaphysical lessons for us. And as we understand that story metaphysically, we understand our own journey better. We understand how we can apply spiritual principles and enhance our journey. One of the interesting things about the story of Exodus, you know, that whole deal where Moses leads the children of Israel out of Egypt and into the desert, where they get lost for 40 years because Moses won't ask for directions. One of the interesting things about that story is how the Hebrew people, the children of Israel, wound up in Egypt to begin with. And that backstory actually goes back about 400 years. Now, we're all probably somewhat familiar with the story of Joseph and his coat of many colors, right? So Joseph winds up in Egypt. He winds up esteemed by the Pharaoh, and he foresees a famine. And so Egypt prepares for the famine, and they're ready. But over in Israel, where Joseph's estranged family is, they don't see what's coming, and they wind up starving. And Jacob, the patriarch of the family, also known as Israel, sends his sons to Egypt to bring back grain for the family. And then there's this whole thing of discovering that the Pharaoh's right-hand man is actually their long-lost brother that they sold into slavery years ago. Well, they wind up in Egypt, they buy grain, they reconnect with their brother, and there's a happy family reunion. They run back to the Middle East, they bring dad, everybody relocates to Egypt, and because that's where the grain is, because Joseph has prepared for the famine, his family not only survives, they thrive. And they do very well. They hang out in Egypt for many generations. This place was their refuge. It was comfortable. It was literally a matter of life and death to them at the beginning. And then they just kind of got settled and comfortable in Egypt. And that worked really well till roughly 400 years later, where what was comfortable what was easy, what was familiar, starts to become uncomfortable. Now, as the story unfolds, we're told that the Pharaoh is concerned about these Hebrew people. He sees that they are multiplying exponentially. Their population is booming, and everything they touch is blessed. They prosper, they do well. And the Pharaoh realizes that if these Hebrew people ever took a notion to side with Egypt's enemies, they would be a significant threat. And so he decides to proactively curtail that possibility. Bible historians tell us that that particular Pharaoh was probably Ramses II, who was the Pharaoh in Egypt in about the 13th century BCE. So the Pharaoh decided these Hebrew people needed to be subjugated. He had to whip them into shape and get them in line. And they were segued into positions of servitude. And the most horrible thing the Pharaoh did is he ordered that all the boy children born to the Hebrew people be slaughtered. He didn't want those little boys growing up to eventually become warriors against Egypt. Well, the Hebrew people were horrified. And as weeks and months led into years of this kind of rule, life got harder and harder for them. What was once their refuge became their prison. What was once familiar and comfortable became a situation of tremendous oppression. We have to ask ourselves from time to time, what is it in my life that has been familiar and comfortable, so familiar and comfortable that I almost didn't notice it's not serving me as well as it once did? And what is going on in my life that's been familiar and comfortable that while it served me once and was good for me, perhaps is no longer as good as it once was? Now, we've been talking a little bit in the last few weeks about the archetypal hero's journey. And the archetypal hero shows up. His name is Moses. Moses is one of those Hebrew boys that was supposed to have been slaughtered at birth, but his mother hid him away in a basket woven of reeds that she floated on the Nile River. And lo and behold, Moses was discovered by none other than the Pharaoh's own daughter, who thought he was such a cute, charming, darling little boy she couldn't imagine anything befalling him, and actually whisked him off to the palace to be brought up as a prince of Egypt. And Moses knew in his heart of hearts who he was, that he was not an Egyptian, and he was one of the children, one of the descendants of Jacob, known as Israel. And he had great compassion for his people. And so one day when he saw one of the Hebrew people being beaten brutally by an overseer, he intervened and took on the Egyptian who was doing the flogging, and in the ensuing melee managed to kill him. And Moses took that deceased Egyptian and buried him in the sands of the desert. And then he fled for his very life. We do that too. Moses had a problem. He had a big problem. And he buried it in the sands of the desert. How often do we have problems and try and cover up what's going on in our life? We even try and bury it for ourselves. You know, those feelings that we have, of anger, of disappointment, of frustration. Oh, we'll bury that, it'll go away. And sooner or later the wind shifts. And sooner or later that sand blows away. And the truth of what's gone on in our lives is discovered. It doesn't matter if it's discovered by other people. It matters when we discover it and realize we have our deeper work yet to do. Our archetypal hero goes to the Sinai desert area. He goes east of Egypt. And as metaphysicians, we have to remember that any time a story leads a character east tells us there's some deep spiritual growth going on. So Moses goes east into the Sinai desert and begins to do his own personal spiritual journey, even as he lives with some Hebrew people there and herds sheep and goats for a gentleman that lived there, and ultimately marries the man's daughter. Through this process, Moses is growing spiritually. He's growing to know who he is as God's creation and as a Hebrew. Now, he's herding sheep one day, and lo and behold, he comes across a burning bush, a shrub that's on fire, and yet not consumed by the flames. He's shocked. Wouldn't we all be? Not only that, the bush starts talking to him. The shrub tells him, "Take off your shoes. You are standing on holy ground." What that bush is telling Moses, and what starts to unfold, is the bush is calling him not to be wrapped up in worldly ideas of what success in the world is about, but to take off his shoes of human understanding and step firmly on holy ground, tapping into deeper, wiser spiritual understanding. And Moses proceeds to have quite the conversation with this burning bush. After the bush tells him to kick off his shoes and stand firmly on holy ground, the bush proceeds to tell him that he needs to return to Egypt and lead the Hebrew people out of slavery, out of servitude. And Moses is rather daunted by this instruction. I don't know if it was a delaying tactic or what he had in mind, but his response is, well, who should I say sent me? This is where that phrase that I know you've heard comes, where that burning bush, or God in expression, says, "I am that I am." God is saying simply, "I am, and I'm sending you as my representative." And he goes on to say, "I will be with you." This is what we need to remember in our times of change and transition. Mother, Father, God, that great divine intelligence that we call on and recognize in ourselves as the Christ expression, no matter what happens, will always be with us. No matter how messy the journey gets, no matter how overwhelmed we are, how daunting it seems, or like Moses, even facing probable death by returning to Egypt, we are never alone. And Moses, somewhat reluctantly, returns to Egypt, and a whole series of interesting events ensue. We could spend a lot of time studying each one of them. But in a nutshell, he goes to Pharaoh and says, "Hey, you gotta let the Hebrew people go." And here Pharaoh listens to his plea and he says, "Nope, not gonna do it." So Moses confers periodically with the Lord God, as he's referred to in the Old Testament, and a series of catastrophes strike Egypt. At one point, the water of the Nile turns red as blood. At another point, locusts descend on the crops in the fields and everything is destroyed. And the ultimate plague that is visited on Egypt is when the firstborn son of every Egyptian family mysteriously dies in the night. And that was the final straw for the Pharaoh. He said, "Okay, take your people, take your stuff, and just get the heck out of Dodge, because we can't deal with this anymore." And so Moses gathers up the Hebrew people and all of their goods and all of their flocks, which are substantial, and they start heading east, a time of spiritual training for them as well. And they bail out of Egypt and they get to the Red Sea. And they're about to cross the Red Sea, and they're kind of in a quandary because they're not seafaring people. And they notice that the Pharaoh at that point has changed his mind, because right behind them, within sight, here comes the whole Egyptian army, ready to capture them and haul them back into captivity. Talk about being stuck between a rock and a hard place. And they turn to Moses and they complain. You brought us out of Egypt here to the desert between the sea and the Pharaoh's army. We're gonna die. And what was it all for? They forgot. They forgot, or they hadn't yet learned, that divine guidance would guide their way. And even while they were complaining about no matter how bad it was back in Egypt, it's still not as bad as the annihilation they think they're facing. But Moses reaches his rod out over the Red Sea and the waters part. And they cross on dry land. And just as the last Hebrew person makes it to the Sinai Peninsula, and the Pharaoh's army enters that same dry land in hot pursuit, Moses again raises his staff, and the waters come crashing down. And Exodus is very specific that every single one of Pharaoh's men and soldiers drowned. The Hebrew people were now alone. And they were just beginning to learn the lesson that they stood on holy ground. And as they looked to Mother, Father, God for divine guidance, that their needs would be met one step at a time and one day at a time. And then they began their wander in the wilderness. They wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. So sit back and get comfortable. We got a lot to cover here. How on earth did it take these people 40 years to traverse what we are told would be about a 2-week journey? Now, as metaphysicians, we know the answer to that too. 40 is the number that basically means it takes as long as it takes. They ventured into the wilderness, into this no man's land, to go through a time of spiritual training, to learn to know themselves standing on holy ground, to learn to turn to Mother, Father, God, and to trust divine guidance. And it kind of took them a while. Isn't that like you and me? I know when I first stepped into a Unity church and I learned for the first time that I had something to say about how my life was unfolding by the thoughts I held and my attitudes and my actions. I thought, oh, this is cool. And about 3 days later, life happened and I completely forgot it. Any of you had that experience? It's real easy to be spiritual Sunday morning, isn't it, at 10 o'clock? By 8 o'clock Monday, it gets a little dicey. We need, like the children of Israel, to immerse ourselves in spiritual principles all the time, and through a whole series of experiences that they had wandering in the wilderness, complaining because they didn't have food, but lo and behold, through Moses, God meets that need. And now their faith is strong until they run out of water. And lo and behold, through their archetypal leader, Moses, water is provided. And they're wandering through the wilderness, wondering, when are we ever going to get to the promised land? And it takes them a heck of a long time, because they have deep and profound spiritual truths that they need to learn, not just here, but here. To take those truths into their being and to live from them day in and day out. The wilderness for us is that time between where we've been and where we're going. This is the spiritual journey that we sang about this morning, Spirit's journey. This is the time where we stand on holy ground, where we let go of our human perceptions and embrace a spiritual perspective, where when we meet life's challenges day in and day out with a spiritual response, this is where we grow spiritually. This is where transformation takes place. What served you well yesterday may not be in your highest good today. It is a journey. And wandering in the wilderness is probably no one's idea of great fun. But it can be a place of great learning and profound transformation at the very depths of our being. You and I, we're here at Unity because there's some part of us that recognizes the value of that spiritual journey. So when we find ourselves wandering in the wilderness, lost in the void between what was and what is, we are called again and again to stand on holy ground, to let go of our human perceptions and know that we know that we know in our heart of hearts. Divine wisdom is always there, always with us. We are never alone. And divine wisdom is guiding our way. And we can know this with surety and confidence as we place one foot in front of the other. So let's close this morning by revisiting our affirmation that reminds us how we can handle life as we're in that wilderness together.
Whatever I'm going through, I set out in faith and confidence, knowing divine guidance is always with me. I stand on holy ground, and I am transformed.
And so it is.